Are there alternatives to immigration into the UK? There's a lot of nonsense talked about this by politicians. I'm Mike Cashman. I write satirical books about this nonsense with Augusta Lee, such as It's My Party and I'll Lie If I Want To, the book with links to more than 120 satirical videos. But this video is a serious one about are there alternatives to immigration into the UK? And by the way, the video is not about any question of morality. It's not about whether we should accept immigrants, but it's just about demography, maths, economics, if you like, about which there's hopefully less disagreement. We'll see. So let's consider, are there alternatives to immigration into the UK? And to answer that question, I want to introduce another country. The country of Exemplaria. This is a fictional country with a number of similarities to the UK, but with some fairly round numbers, which will help in explaining the argument. Now, in Exemplaria, for every age of person, from age 25 up to 64, there are 800,000 people. From 0 up to 24, there are 700,000 people of each age. So there was that number from 0 to 17 and that number from 18 to 24. From 65 up to 74, there are 600,000 people of each age. And on average, from age 75 to 89, there are 300,000 people of each age. And we're going to stop the argument there. There may be some over 90s, but they can come into they can be included in the people in their 80s. Now, you may have spotted with the lower numbers at the lower end of the age range that probably the birth rate in Exemplaria has been low for a while, or lower than it used to be. So in Exemplaria, in each year of 400,000 females and 400,000 males, each female, on average, through her lifetime, has 1.75 babies. And so that cohort of 800,000 people, 400,000 women, 400,000 men, ends up having 700,000 babies. If you like, you can assume that on average, 7/8 of the women have a baby at age 28, and 7/8 of the women have a baby at age 32. And so on average, each woman has 1.75 babies. Some have none, some have more, but that's the average. Now, each year that goes by, 700,000 people enter the workforce. Let's assume that they all do that at age 18. And by the way, by workforce here, I am referring to those productively engaged in employment, study, or looking after younger or older people. A bit of a simplification, but this is Exemplaria. Now, each year, 800,000 people leave the workforce. Now, you may look at the numbers and say, well, hang on, how does that work? Because don't some retire early or indeed die early? And what about that 800,000 dropping to 600,000 from 65 to 66? These are averages. Actually, never mind all that. If you just imagine, if you just look at that population distribution and assume that that is the way that it's been and the way that it continues, except of course that each year the cohort where there were only 700,000 people of them get 1 year older, then you can see that each year in that big block of 800,000 people per year, we lose 1 year at the top end, and at the bottom end in comes 700,000 people. Now you may say, but it's not true that exactly 800,000 people leave the workforce in 2024, for example, because some of them may have retired earlier before that, some of them may have died earlier. Now that's true, but if you look at this demographic distribution, this is going to be exactly balanced by the number of younger people who do retire earlier, who do die before that age in 2024, for example. So one way or another, if you look at that distribution, 800,000 people are going to be leaving the workforce every year. And so we have 100,000 fewer people in this workforce in the middle, where if you add them all up, you have 37.5 million people who are in that workforce and 22.5 million people who are dependent in one way or another. That ratio, in fact, is 5 out of every 8 people are in the workforce and 3 out of every 8 people are dependent, the way the numbers are at the moment. But it is changing because this lower birth rate has been going on for some time. And by the way, that birth rate of 1.75 babies per woman during her lifetime on average is exactly what the birth rate has been in the UK. And in fact, let us compare the graph of the Exemplaria population, here it is, with the graph of the UK population. It has some slight, some greater unevenness. It's not quite as neat as the Exemplaria population, but it is essentially the same model. And thereby is the problem. Each year in Exemplaria, and roughly speaking in the UK as well, there are 100,000 fewer people in the workforce. And one way to resolve that has been through immigration. Now, there are other ways to resolve it that have been used over the years, because you can see this has been happening for some time. You could have a greater degree of manufacturing automation. You could outsource some manufacturing to elsewhere so that there's fewer manufacturing jobs required in the country. You can outsource some services and automate them. You could have fewer banks, more online banking, call centres staffed overseas, more automated supermarket checkouts. But all these cards have already been played. What is more difficult to automate is personal service. Any service where the person has to be in a particular place to do it. For example, to interact with another person, such as in hospitality, medical care, social care. You also have jobs such as HGV driving, vegetable and fruit picking, where the job has to be done in a certain place or places. It can't easily be outsourced elsewhere. And so the need for a continued extra, in our case, 100,000 people, is quite evident. You could, of course, increase the retirement age. Now, that has been done. Typically, the retirement age is increased with the rationale that people are living longer, and so there's a greater life expectancy, and therefore the cut-off point between working and retiring should move up with it. It's not usually put forward, I've never heard it being put forward, on the basis of, well, we don't want to have so many immigrants, so let's have a population that's currently in the country working for longer. And in any case, that sort of move introduces into the workforce a number of people in their late 60s now. I'm in my late 60s, and I'm not saying that there's jobs I can't do, but this may not be as flexible a workforce as people coming in who are younger. And there is an imbalance, or there is a difference between the birth rate in different parts of the world. Hans Rosling has done some great TED Talks on this, and this has come to the conclusion that the world population will level out to, he originally said 10 billion, he came to the conclusion it would be 11 billion. The point is that in richer countries, the birth rate tends to drop. I haven't heard anybody in the UK who said to me, well, I want to have 5, 6, 7 or 8 children because I'm concerned that some of them might die in infancy and I want there to be a number of them around to look after me in my old age. But that may well be said in many poorer countries, though the general trend, thankfully, is that poverty tends to reduce countries become more prosperous, the birth rate drops. But currently, the birth rate is higher in many countries, and the way the world economics levels this out is by immigration from some of those countries into countries such as Exemplaria or the UK, where the birth rate is lower. Immigrants generally want to come to work. It's not true for everybody, but that is the primary pull. And they're positive for the UK economy. So they arrive very often as adults, already educated, brought up, ready to be productive, spend time in the workforce, and some of them leave the country at the point of retirement. So immigrants are positive for the UK economy. But are there other alternatives? We talked about increasing retirement age. Is there an opportunity for greater degree of automation so that we can cope with the lower numbers in the workforce? As I say, many of the cards have already been played. Let's look at what has been harder to reduce the workforce for. Hospitality, for example. Could you imagine a pub of the future where there are no bar staff? You go up to a screen at the bar, you enter your order for drinks, much as in a fast food checkout of fast food ordering screen at the moment, and after a suitable delay, a tray of drinks arrives, perhaps behind a perspex screen which you unlock with your credit card or your phone that you're paying with, and you take your drinks. It's possible. I don't think that's a future that I would look forward to. Could you be having your heart bypass operation on an operating table in a UK hospital where the surgeon performing the operation by remote control, looking at a screen, is overseas, it's in India or somewhere? Again, that's not a prospect that I would look forward to. So, as I say, many of the cards that can be played for automation have already been played. And politicians talk about, oh, we mustn't use the easy lever of immigration. We should be training up our own people. Trouble with that is, unless you increase the total size of the workforce, then you're just moving the problem around. There were calls after Brexit for, well, if there's a shortage of HGV drivers, we must solve that by paying HGV drivers more. And HGV driver pay went up. More people came to be HGV drivers who had previously been driving buses, refuse lorries, ambulances. So you move the problem around, but unless you can increase the total size of the workforce, you're not solving the problem. Now, I know the total population size is reducing on that basis, but if the reduction comes entirely out of the productive workforce, then you've got an imbalance which, as I say, unless you see a greater degree of automation, the obvious way, the economic way, by which I mean the way that economics tends to push us, is to bring in from overseas, to attract from overseas those who can do the work, who want to do the work, who are happy to do the work for the wages that are available. In other words, a continued use of immigration. But what do you think the alternatives are? By the way, if the death rate goes up, in general, that tends to mean that people are dying a bit earlier than they otherwise would have done. So it doesn't make an enormous amount of difference in total. By all means, sit and work through the numbers. I've given you some examples, and the Exemplaria numbers are very similar to the UK numbers. So let's have an informed debate about this. Let's not look at it one-dimensionally and simply say, we want less immigration. If you're going to make that argument, then work out how the UK is going to cope economically in the future and how it's going to look after you in your old age. I'd be interested in your comments. Please like and support the channel, subscribe, buy the books. I look forward to hearing what it is that you may have to say. Thank you.